It begins with the sound of wind through wooden beams. You can almost hear it now, the quiet creak of a thatched roof, the slow breathing of a world that has long fallen silent. Somewhere, a candle flickers inside a small stone cottage, and a young woman is awake long before dawn. Her name is Mara, and her hands already ache before the day has even begun. But before we meet her properly, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what it truly felt like to be born a woman in the Middle Ages, when life itself was so fragile, and freedom was a word you might only hear in a prayer? Tonight, we'll step quietly into that world. Not the world of queens or knights, but the one hidden behind the walls, the kitchens, the fields, the rooms where history rarely looked. So close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the story unfold. Mara's cottage stood on the edge of a small English village, a scatter of houses pressed close to the fields. In the early morning, when mist still clung to the grass, she tied her rough linen apron and stepped outside, the cold biting her skin. The sky was gray, the air smelled of damp earth, and she walked barefoot to fetch water from the stream. The bucket was heavy, the handle cutting into her palms. It was her first task of the day, one of dozens. She would feed the chickens, sweep the floor, knead the dough, and by the time the sun was fully risen, she would already be exhausted. That was the rhythm of a peasant woman's life in those centuries, work that began with the sunrise and ended only when sleep took you by mercy. For women like Mara, there was no time to dream of adventure, no pause to rest the mind. Every hour was claimed by survival itself. But still, she found small moments of beauty. Sometimes, when she hung the linen to dry, she'd pause and look at the hills in the distance, soft and blue, brushed by mist. She wondered what lay beyond them. No one she knew had ever gone far enough to find out. Her mother told her not to think of such things. A woman's thoughts, she'd say, are like wild geese, they wander too far. Mara would smile quietly, but inside, she wondered if that was true. Life for medieval women was shaped by invisible rules, rules made by men, by the church, by tradition itself. From the moment a girl was born, she carried expectations heavier than any bucket or plow. She was her father's duty, then her husband's property, and finally her children's caretaker. Yet most never complained, or rather, they couldn't. Words like choice and independence weren't part of the language they knew. But deep within, there was still a quiet spark, a need to understand, to belong, to be seen. Mara's days passed in cycles, planting, harvest, washing, mending. But she was different in one small way, she loved words. There was an old traveling monk who visited the village once every season. He came with scrolls and stories. And Mara would linger nearby as he spoke Latin prayers none of the peasants understood. But she listened anyway, not to the meaning, but to the sound. The rhythm soothed her, like music. One afternoon, as she carried bread to the manor, she dared to speak to him. "Father," she said softly, "how do you make the marks that sound like song?" He looked at her, surprised, then smiled. "They are letters, child. Marks that remember words so we do not forget." "Can anyone learn them?" she asked. The monk paused. "Anyone with patience, and permission." Permission. It was a word that weighed heavy. Women were not forbidden to learn, but neither were they expected to. Knowledge was considered dangerous, something that could make a woman question her place. Still, when the monk left the next day, Mara found a small scrap of parchment hidden in her basket. On it, a few letters scratched in ink, A, B, C. That night, she stared at it by candlelight, tracing the shapes with her finger until she fell asleep. Let me pause here for a moment, just to remind you of something. When we look back at the Middle Ages, it's easy to think only of knights and kings, but the real world, the one that truly existed, was built on the backs of women like Mara. They worked, suffered, raised children, held families together. And yet, their names were rarely written anywhere. Their stories disappeared with the smoke of their hearths. But sometimes, one or two names survived, not because history wanted them to, but because someone cared enough to remember. Months passed. The harvest came, harsh and meager. The men worked the fields, but it was the women who kept the food from spoiling, who spun thread through winter nights, who nursed the sick when the fever swept through the village. When Mara's younger brother fell ill, she stayed awake for 3 nights, cooling his forehead with damp cloths. She prayed to saints she barely knew, whispered promises to a heaven that stayed silent. He survived, barely. And when he finally spoke again, she smiled through tears and said, "Perhaps God listens, even to women." Her mother only frowned. "Hush, child. You'll bring misfortune speaking so." In those days, even faith had its boundaries. Meanwhile, high above the village, in the manor on the hill, another woman lived, Lady Isolde. She was born into silk, not straw, but her world was just as narrow in its own way. From her earliest memory, her life was shaped by duty, to her father, to the house, to the alliance her marriage would seal. She was told what to wear, what to read, what to believe. At 16, she was promised to a man twice her age, a wealthy lord whose lands bordered her father's. On the night before her wedding, she stood by the window, watching the torches flicker below. The stars looked cold and distant. Her maid whispered, "You're lucky, my lady." "Am I?" Isolde murmured. Her marriage was comfortable but loveless. Her husband cared for his horses more than her. Her words were rarely asked for, her silence often praised. And yet, within her quiet heart, something refused to fade, the same spark that burned in Mara. Sometimes, when the manor scribe left the study open, Isolde would slip inside and touch the books, parchment smelling of dust and ink, the pages soft from years of turning. She couldn't read all the Latin, but she traced the letters anyway, feeling the rhythm of words she didn't yet understand. One afternoon, she found a poem written by a woman, a rare treasure. It spoke of the sea, of freedom, of love beyond walls. Isolde read it again and again, until she could whisper the words from memory. When her husband died of fever a few years later, she wept, not for love lost, but for the life she might now shape. As a widow, she had a strange kind of freedom, still watched, still judged, but less bound than before. She used that freedom quietly. She began to invite the daughters of her servants to the manor and taught them letters, simple ones at first. She said, "A woman's mind is not a sin. It is a garden, if we dare to plant it." Back in the village, Mara's path crossed with Isolde's one winter morning. The manor needed new hands for the kitchen and laundry, and Mara was chosen. At first, she feared the stone corridors and the echoing rooms. But soon she found herself drawn to Lady Isolde's calm voice, to her gentle insistence that even small lives mattered. One evening, as they worked together mending linens, Isolde asked, "You can read a little, can't you?" Mara hesitated, then nodded. "Then you must help me teach the girls," Isolde said with a smile. "2 hands are better than 1. And so, beneath the quiet roof of that manor, a hidden classroom began. By candlelight, the girls whispered letters, wrote names, stumbled over words. Mara taught them what she knew, Isolde guided them with patience. They called it the night school. It was secret, simple, and dangerous. Because not everyone approved. The village priest soon heard whispers that women were gathering to read. He came to the manor one cold morning, robes heavy with frost, and demanded an audience. "My lady," he said sternly, "knowledge breeds sin when left to unguarded hearts. The church gives women their place, not above their station." Isolde bowed her head respectfully. "We teach only the prayers and scriptures, father." "Then be careful," he warned, "for the serpent often hides in curiosity." When he left, Isolde looked at Mara and sighed. "We will be careful. But we will not stop." And they didn't. As the years passed, more girls came. The night school became a sanctuary, a place where young women learned not only letters, but courage. One girl, Ellen, said softly, "My mother never learned her own name on paper." "My mother never learned her own name on paper." Mara took her hand and wrote it out for her, Elin. The girl stared at it as if seeing her soul for the first time. Moments like that gave Mara strength. But life was still cruel in many ways. The world outside did not change overnight. Marriages were arranged, childbirth claimed lives, hunger returned each winter. And when the plague finally came, the one they would later call the Black Death, it did not care for courage or kindness. Mara's mother fell ill first. She fought the fever for days, whispering prayers between breaths. Mara held her hand until the end, whispering back, "I'll keep your stories alive." She buried her quietly beneath the oak tree near the stream. For weeks after, the cottage felt empty, but at the manor, the girls waited, their books clutched close. Mara returned to them, weary but determined. "We will read tonight," she said. "Let me tell you something. History can be cruel, yes, but it also listens, eventually. Every small act of defiance, every quiet kindness, every whispered prayer, they build the foundation of the world we know now." Mara and Isolde did not live to see equality, nor freedom as we imagine it today. But because of women like them, those ideas began to exist, faintly, like dawn over frost. Years later, as the plague faded and life returned, Mara stood again under the oak tree where she had once learned her first letters. The bark felt older, rougher, but the sound of the stream was the same. She thought of her mother, of the monk, of Isolde, and of the girls who could now write their names. She smiled and whispered, "Maybe this is what freedom feels like, not the absence of burden, but the right to choose your path under it." Above her, the wind moved through the branches, carrying away her words. And if you listen closely, truly listen, you can almost hear them even now, echoing across the centuries. Because though life was brutal for medieval women, their hearts were not broken. They bent, they endured, and somehow, they found grace in the silence. The years moved quietly after the plague faded, like dust settling after a storm. The village healed little by little, new births, new roofs, new songs by the hearth. Yet, even in recovery, something in the air had changed. People spoke more softly about faith, about life and death, as if both were now familiar neighbors. And in that gentler silence, women like Mara and Isolde found room to breathe. At the old manor, where ivy crept up the stone walls and candlelight still glowed through narrow windows, the night school had returned. Its benches were rough and its ink scarce, but to the women who gathered there, it felt like a cathedral. Mara sat by the window each evening, a shawl over her shoulders, the book open on her lap. Around her, the young girls whispered letters, their quills scratching softly. Isolde sat nearby, her hands folded, her face lit by the flame. When one of the girls stumbled over a word, Isolde would smile and say, "Take your time. Every word learned is a door unlocked." Those words became their motto. Outside the manor, though, the world remained hard. Taxes rose. Crops failed. Husbands drank away their wages. And for many women, the word freedom still meant only a few steps beyond their doorstep. Yet change, even the quiet kind, often begins beneath notice. Some evenings, Mara and Isolde would sit by the fire after the students had gone, sipping warm cider, listening to the wind. "Do you think it matters?" Mara asked once. "What we do here?" Isolde smiled, watching the embers fall. "Everything that survives begins small. A seed, a whisper, a thought." Mara nodded, though she was never certain. But she would remember that sentence for the rest of her life. Spring came again. The earth turned soft, the rivers loud with thaw. Mara now taught not only girls, but mothers, women her own age who had never learned to write their names. They came shyly, after sundown, bringing bread or milk and thanks. They sat stiffly on the benches, laughing nervously as they tried to hold the quill. "You see," Mara would tell them, "it isn't magic. Just patience." One woman, Agnes, said softly, "My husband says reading makes women proud." Mara smiled. "Then tell him pride is a good posture for carrying heavy things." They laughed, quietly, but it was laughter all the same. Meanwhile, in the manor above, Isolde was growing older. The silver in her hair caught the candlelight like frost. Her son now managed the estate, though she remained its calm center. He was kinder than most men of his rank, perhaps because he had watched his mother defy the small cruelties of the world with quiet grace. Still, even kindness had its limits. "Mother," he told her one morning, "the priest complains again of your lessons." He says they distract the servants from their duties. Isolde turned her gaze to the window, where the apple trees were in bloom. If duty means silence, perhaps distraction is a blessing. Her son sighed but said nothing more. That summer brought new faces to the village, travelers, masons, and one unusual visitor, a widow named Alice, who claimed to have once lived in London. Her hands were calloused from spinning silk, her voice calm and clever. When she heard of Mara's lessons, she joined them eagerly, bringing with her a handful of stories, tales of markets, ships, and far-off cities. The girls listened wide-eyed. "Is it true," one asked, "that in London a woman may own a shop?" Alice smiled. "Aye, if she's stubborn enough to pay the guild her weight in silver." The laughter that followed was warm. And so the lessons grew, letters, numbers, songs, even stories from far beyond the hills. Let me pause here a moment. When we speak of the medieval world, we often forget its quiet revolutions, not battles or crowns, but small acts of courage done in kitchens and fields. A woman lighting a candle after dark to read. A mother teaching her child a letter instead of a prayer. Those moments, repeated across generations, were what slowly changed the shape of time. But every change meets resistance. One winter's night, as snow whispered against the windows, the priest returned, this time not alone. Behind him stood two men from the Lord's court, carrying torches. "My lady," he said coldly, "we have orders to inspect these gatherings. There are rumors, talk of women meeting after curfew, spreading ideas." Mara felt her stomach twist. Isolde rose, calm but pale. "These women learn to read scripture," she said evenly. "Nothing more." The priest frowned. "And yet you allow them to write? To think? To question?" For a moment, no one breathed. Then Isolde answered quietly. "Even angels question. It is only devils who command without thought." The priest's face hardened, but he said nothing further. He left with the men, torches crackling in the snow. That night, the students did not return. The manor felt hollow. But the next evening, one by one, the girls came back, hoods pulled low. No one spoke. They simply sat down and opened their books. The lesson continued. Years passed like pages turning. Mara grew into her middle years, lines forming at her eyes, a calm steadiness in her voice. Her hands, once rough from labor, were now ink-stained. Isolde grew frilier, her steps slower, but her mind remained bright. She began dictating her thoughts to Mara, who wrote them carefully in a small journal bound with thread. "These are not memoirs," Isolde said. "Just things I wish someone had told me when I was young." Mara smiled. "Then I'll make sure someone does." When Isolde fell ill one spring, Mara sat beside her every evening. Outside, the orchard bloomed, the air smelled of apple and rain. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked softly. "Defying them all?" Isolde smiled faintly. "No. I regret only that I didn't begin sooner." Her voice faded, but her eyes stayed bright. "Promise me, Mara. Don't let it end here. Teach them to teach." Mara squeezed her hand. "I promise." When dawn came, Isolde was gone, her face peaceful, her hands folded as if still in prayer. Mara wept quietly. The manor bells tolled through the valley. Weeks later, when the household gathered for her memorial, Mara placed the small journal on the altar. On its cover, she wrote 2 words, "For those after." It was the first book ever written entirely by women in that valley. After Isolde's passing, the responsibility fell to Mara. She expanded the lessons, moving them to the village itself, where more could join. Some men even began to bring their daughters, curious to see what all the talk was about. Slowly, the fear began to fade. The priest grew older and quieter. The new one, a younger man, even sent parchment as donation. Mara often said, when one generation opens a door, the next must keep it from closing. As the decades rolled on, Mara became the village's oldest teacher. Children called her Mistress Mara, though she always insisted she was just a servant of words. One evening, a young woman named Eleanor, a child she had once taught, returned from the city carrying a printed book. The new invention of the printing press had begun spreading through England, changing everything. Eleanor laid the book on Mara's table. "Look," she whispered, "they can make 100 copies now, the same words, everywhere." Mara touched the pages reverently. Tears filled her eyes. "All those years we copied by hand," she murmured, "and now ink does it for us." Eleanor smiled. "You helped prepare us for it." Mara laughed softly. "No, child. We only kept the candle lit until the sun rose." Let me pause again. That's the strange beauty of history. Progress arrives quietly, on the shoulders of people who never saw it themselves. The world changes because of those who never stopped believing it could. Mara would never know how far her lessons would travel, how the idea of women reading and writing would grow from small villages to cities, from England to distant lands. She only knew that words felt like home. The final years of her life were gentle. The school became her life's rhythm: morning prayers, midday lessons, evening rest. She lived long enough to see her students teaching others, long enough to see books becoming common, long enough to see a few women signing their own names on marriage papers. And one quiet evening, she walked once more to the oak tree by the stream, the same place where it had all begun. The air smelled of earth and rain, the sunset glowed through the branches. She sat down beneath it, the same parchment in her hand, now yellow with age. The letters, A, B, C, had faded, but she traced them anyway. She smiled. "It started with these," she whispered. "And it will never end." When the wind moved through the leaves, it almost sounded like pages turning. Centuries later, the village would change beyond recognition. The manor would crumble, rebuilt as a school. The oak tree would fall, but its roots would remain, woven through the soil. Archaeologists would one day find a piece of parchment buried nearby, faint Latin letters, written by a woman's hand. They would place it carefully in a museum and write on the plaque, "Anonymous, 14th century." But she was not anonymous, not really. She was Mara. And beside her, once, was Isolde. Two women who dared to whisper letters into a world that did not want to hear them. Soft music fades to a final, tender melody. And if you're still awake, listening to their story, perhaps you can feel it, that thread that runs from their time to ours. Every book you hold, every word you read, every thought you dare to write, traces back to those hands in the candlelight. Their lives were hard, yes, brutal even. But within that brutality, they built something unbreakable. Hope. And in the quiet of night, as you drift toward sleep, remember this: the world you live in was shaped by people who never gave up on gentleness, even when life gave them none.